Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive. Have you ever stopped and thought about how much big tech is tied in with the government?
You know, it's something that's been on a lot of people's minds, especially since the whole Trump administration era.
It feels like it really kicked into high gear around then, didn't it?
Yeah, and it's led some folks to seriously consider becoming like digital expats, trying to minimize their reliance on US-based digital services altogether.
That's a big step. And it definitely raises a ton of questions, right? Like how realistic is that even? And what are the real motivations behind this whole movement?
Well, that's what we're going to explore today. We're diving deep into why this is becoming such a pressing issue, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it. We've got a bunch of really fascinating articles and expert opinions to unpack, so buckle up.
This isn't just about some fringe group anymore. I mean, even in Europe, there's this growing sense of unease about whether U.S. data services are truly safe. And it becomes even more concerning when you look at things like the VDEM project's recent assessment. They're suggesting the U.S. could be on a path towards becoming an electoral autocracy, placing it alongside countries like Turkey and Russia.
Yeah, and when you consider that context, these data privacy questions suddenly take on a whole new level of urgency. Like if we're potentially heading in that direction, what does that mean for the security and privacy of our data?
It's a huge question. So let's start by unpacking this idea of big tech cozying up to the Trump administration. It really seemed to start even before he took office, right?
It did. I mean, think about the inauguration. Amazon, Meta, Google, Microsoft, Uber each threw in $1 million. And then you had big individual donors like Zuckerberg from Meta and Tim Cook from Apple. That's a serious financial commitment right out of the gate.
It really sets the stage for a certain type of relationship, doesn't it? And it wasn't just about the money either. We saw real policy changes within some of these companies, particularly Meta. They made some pretty significant shifts, and they openly cited aligning with the Trump administration's values as a key factor.
What were some of those changes? Give us the specifics, because this is where it gets really interesting.
Well, for starters, they permitted more hate speech and abuse on really sensitive topics, things like immigration and gender. This was a major departure from their previous stance and a huge concern for a lot of people. Then they basically sidelined fact-checkers, which led to even more worries about misinformation spreading unchecked. And another thing that didn't get as much attention was the introduction of pro-life moderation actions pretty much right after the inauguration.
Wow. I remember Zuckerberg actually talking about this at the time. He spoke about an opportunity to have a productive partnership with the U.S. government. That says a lot, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's not like Meta was the only one. We saw Google literally rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America on their maps and search, all because of a Trump executive order, even though the U.S. doesn't have exclusive control over those waters.
That's wild. It really shows how far they were willing to go.
Yeah, and it wasn't a one-off thing either. There were updates across maps, calendar, search, all seemingly reflecting the administration's priorities. They even removed certain banned terms from Google Health.
But maybe the biggest red flag was the revival of Project Dragonfly. That was Google's plan to create a censored search engine for China.
Right, which could have helped the Chinese government with their surveillance efforts. It was a complete reversal of their previous commitments on censorship.
It makes you think, why is all this so important? And I think the answer lies in understanding big tech's core business model. They thrive on collecting and analyzing our data, right?
Exactly. They're essentially operating as massive surveillance systems, collecting data on practically every aspect of our lives.
And that's where the real concern comes in. Because when you connect the dots, these companies become these hugely powerful gatekeepers between our private lives and the government's desire for information.
Absolutely. Even with legal frameworks in place, the sheer volume of data they control gives them enormous influence over what information the government can even access.
So it's not just about whether the government is requesting data legally. It's about what data is even available for them to request in the first place. That shifts the whole power dynamic, doesn't it?
It does, and it makes you question how effective traditional safeguards actually are. The things like the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, court rulings, and the hope that tech companies would push back against government overreach. Those all become less certain when you have this level of collaboration going on.
All right, so let's break down exactly how the government can legally get our data from these tech giants. What are the tools they use?
Well, you've got the standard legal procedures like subpoenas, court orders, and search warrants. Those usually require some level of judicial review. But then there are things like national security letters or NSLs. Those are authorized under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA.
Now, FISA, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
It can be. Google themselves have publicly said that FISA orders can force them to hand over electronic surveillance and stored data. This includes things like your Gmail content, your Google Drive files, even your Google Photos. The scope is really broad.
So we're talking about not just metadata, but the actual content of your communications and files. That's pretty alarming.
And an NSL is a secret request from the government that doesn't always need a judge's approval. It forces tech companies to give up your data, often without you ever knowing. So it bypasses traditional legal checks and balances.
This all reminds me of that big showdown between the FBI and Apple back in 2016. Remember when they tried to force Apple to create a backdoor into an iPhone?
Oh, absolutely. That was a defining moment. Apple refused, arguing that it would weaken security for everyone.
And what was Trump's response?
He called for a boycott of Apple products until they caved. It showed how much the administration wanted to weaken encryption to make it easier for the government to get access to data.
And that led to this whole push by Trump's Justice Department to label encrypted communications as law-free zones, right? There was even talk about trying to ban unbreakable encryption altogether.
It was a pretty aggressive campaign. But here's the strange part. Right before Trump returned to politics, the FBI actually recommended that Americans use encrypted messaging apps to protect themselves from cyber threats.
So did they change their tune?
Well, it's unclear. The current White House is pretty vague on the issue. They talk about a golden age of digital literacy and working with tech companies, but they don't really address the conflict between security and government access.
So there's still a lot of uncertainty around this whole encryption debate. And this isn't just an American issue either, right? What happens with big tech here in the U.S. affects people all over the world.
Absolutely. Especially for countries that rely on these platforms for things like emergency response or spreading important health information. Imagine if those platforms are suddenly influenced by U.S. political agendas.
That's a scary thought.
We even saw reports of officials in New Zealand considering ditching meta platforms entirely. They were worried about the safety of their communities and the integrity of their democracy.
And then you have the VDem project's prediction that the U.S. could become an electoral autocracy.
Right.
That's a big deal. It basically means elections might still happen, but democratic norms are so eroded that there's very little real competition or freedom.
It paints a pretty bleak picture, and it makes data privacy even more urgent, especially for countries that might clash with U.S. foreign policy. Imagine if the data held by American tech companies could be used against them.
So what can people do? Realistically, telling everyone to just delete their accounts on Facebook, Google, and everything else isn't practical. Our lives are too intertwined with these platforms.
Right. But there are steps you can take. Switching certain services can make a big difference, like moving from WhatsApp to Signal for messaging or checking out Bluesky instead of X, formerly known as Twitter. It's about being mindful of where your data is and making choices to minimize your risk.
So it's like editing your digital footprint. You can't erase it completely, but you can be smarter about what you leave behind.
Exactly. And the good news is there's a whole ecosystem of secure non-US alternatives popping up. The market is responding to these concerns, and we're seeing some really user-friendly options.
Okay, so let's get into those alternatives. For essential stuff like email, storage, and VPNs, ProtonMail is a solid choice. They're based in Switzerland and have a strong stance on protecting data, especially related to abortion, which is covered under Swiss law.
Then for navigation, ditch Google Maps and try Magic Earth, TomTom Amigo, or Here We Go. They're all based in the Netherlands. And there's also OpenStreetMap, which is a global open source project.
I've heard good things about Vivaldi for web browsing too. It's developed in Norway and known for being privacy-focused.
And if you want to move away from Google search, check out Qwant in France or StartPage in the Netherlands. For building websites, there's Ionos, a German company that's a good alternative to Squarespace, or Wix. Even social media has alternatives like PixelFed, which is based in Canada and focuses on privacy.
It's great to see all these choices becoming available.
There are even alternatives for more niche things, like Storygraph for tracking your reading, which is from the UK, or Affinity and Canva for design software. They're both based outside the US, unlike Adobe. And for ebooks, there's Kobo, which is Canadian and Japanese.
For media streaming, you've got Plex and Jellyfin and Nextcloud for secure file storage. And LibreOffice is a great alternative to Microsoft Office. It's completely free and open source and not based in the US.
And for developers, there's Codeberg in the EU, a privacy-focused alternative to GitHub. It's amazing to see how much is out there.
Even for archiving, There are initiatives like the European hosting of the CDC's pre-Trump website and the Internet Archive Canada using Filecoin. These are great examples of people taking digital preservation seriously.
And there are resources out there to help you find even more alternatives, like the non-US alternatives list and European alternatives. These are great starting points for anyone who wants to explore these options further.
It seems like there's a real movement building around this too. The de-Googling trend. I was reading about the Door De-Google subreddit. It has over 250,000 members sharing tips and advice.
I even saw a story about someone who canceled all their US subscription streaming, PayPal, Amazon, and switched to Proton and other non-US services. It shows how serious people are about this.
So, to wrap things up, it seems like the main reasons people are looking for non-US digital services boil down to a few core concerns. Big tech getting too cozy with government policies, potential for increased government surveillance, and worries about the future of democracy.
And the key takeaway is that there are real alternatives out there. Taking control of your digital life and protecting your privacy is absolutely possible.
So, here's something for you to think about. Knowing all of this, what part of your digital life are you most interested in examining more closely? Or maybe even changing?
And if this deep dive has been valuable for you, if it's given you some knowledge, some motivation to take control of your digital life, maybe even inspired you to explore some of these alternatives, then we encourage you to check out our YouTube channel, Necessary Cookies.
We don't just report on the news or tell stories. We really try to go deeper, exploring these complex topics to help you make sense of the world and become the best version of yourself.
So if you're looking for more insightful content that can guide you toward wisdom and success, subscribe to Necessary Cookies. We'd love to have you join our community.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.